All right. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our February presentation of the York Civil War Roundtable. My name is Adam Bentz, and I am the Director of the Library and Archives at the York County History Center. With us tonight is Dr. Robert Colby from the University of Mississippi, and he'll be speaking on a topic which I don't personally know a whole lot about. I've taught an aspect of it when I've taught the Civil War and Reconstruction myself, but I by no means have any kind of knowledge along the lines of what he has done in his own research. And I think it's a fascinating and important topic that we don't often think about when we talk about the Civil War. So I'm really looking forward to this tonight personally. The Civil War Roundtable has invited him to speak this evening because February is Black History Month, and I think this is a great topic for us to explore that in more detail. If you can bear with me, as usual, we have some upcoming events for the York County History Center. And you can see we have a whole bunch of events. I couldn't believe how many there were when I was looking through our calendar. Um, Incidentally, if you haven't noticed, we very recently updated our website, and I'm hoping that's working out for everybody at home. If not, please feel free to drop me an email. It is a bit of a work in progress, although our team upstairs has been working on it for well over a year. But we have a brand new website which has been out for 2 or 3 weeks, and I think it works a lot better as far as the experience for people who are actually trying to get information. So if you have any issues, please feel free to drop me a line. So without further ado, let's talk about some upcoming events. This coming Monday night, that's February 24th at 7 o'clock p.m., our bookmarked program. This will be on site at 7 o'clock p.m. The bookmarked team is welcoming local author Michael Maloney, who will be discussing his book, Rattlesnake Colonel, Thomas Cresap, An American Paradox. It's a great local story taking place in the years leading up to the American Revolution, in that period of great flux between conflicting land claims between Pennsylvania and Maryland, as well as indigenous Native American claims. So please join us on Monday night for that. A week from this evening, that's February 26th at 7 o'clock p.m. This is on site at the History Center. The All Vets organization is welcoming veteran Robin Fisher, who served in the United States in Vietnam. So Robin will be talking about that experience. On Sunday, March 2nd, that's Sunday, March 2nd at 2:30 p.m. On site at the History Center, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be welcoming current president Richard Conkle, who will be discussing the history and genealogy of New Sweden. And I just spoke with him today, and he personally has multiple relatives who were Swedish immigrants in the years long before William Penn arrived on the scene. So it's a fascinating story. That's Sunday, March 2nd. Then Tuesday, March 4th, as many people refer to it, Fat Tuesday, also known as Mardi Gras. From 10 to 12 p.m., the York County History Center Friends will be presenting Fosnot Day. So please feel free to stop by for free Fosnots, coffee, warm tea, other things like that. So free goodies that night before the official start of the Lenten season for those who participate. That's Tuesday. Let's see. That means March 6th would be a Thursday. So Thursday at 7 o'clock p.m., another library partner program. Our Writers Roundtable will be visiting the History Center. This is on site. And I believe retired teacher Norina Bensel will be discussing her book. She experienced this personally. And then later wrote a book about the period in the aftermath of the 2001 attack on the North Hopewell Winterstown Elementary School. Quite a tragic attack. And she'll be talking about her experience and being able to put something together about reminiscences, but also more importantly, the story of how the community grew together after that event. So that's Thursday, March 6th. Then on Sunday, March 9th at 1 o'clock p.m. At the History Center, we will be welcoming local author, local history activist Samantha Dorm, who will be talking about the preachers, the people, and the praise, a history of York's Black churches. She's a great speaker. I've heard her many times, and she's spoken to the Civil War Roundtable before. So please join us that Sunday, March 9th at 1 o'clock p.m. at the History Center. And finally, 9, 10, 11, 12. Let's see, that would be Wednesday the 12th at 6 p.m. again on site at the History Center, Pennsylvania Women and Voting Rights, with speaker Amanda Owen, who represents the Justice Bell Foundation. So those are all upcoming events over the next few weeks. And you're probably all wondering, okay, but what about the Civil War Roundtable? Yes, so we will be recommencing on-site Civil War Roundtable at the History Center on March 19th. I love the months that have 28 days because it makes it so easy to put these together. March 19th, exactly a month from tonight at 7 o'clock p.m. on site at the History Center. Dominish, also known as Dami Marie Miller, MLS, is presenting her new talk, The Not So Invisible Women, the Daughters of Charity, Contributions During and After the Battle of Gettysburg. More than 230 Daughters of Charity, Catholic sisters, served as nurses during the American Civil War. Gettysburg's close proximity to Emmitsburg, Maryland, about 10 miles, allowed the Daughters of Charity to step into the spotlight and leave a lasting mark on the town. Please join us for Women's History Month as we learn about the only trained nurses at the start of the Civil War. So that's a month from tonight, 7 o'clock p.m. The York Civil War Roundtable will be starting up in person once again at the new History Center. So thank you for bearing with me on the upcoming announcements. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. So Dr. Robert Colby, as I said, is a member of the history department at the University of Mississippi, and he will be presenting An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Dr. Colby's research explores the social, military, and political experience of the Civil War era with a special emphasis on slavery in the process of emancipation. His current book project examines the survival of the domestic slave trade during the war, demonstrating the ways in which Confederates used slave commerce to survive the conflict and the ways in which it shaped the onset of African American freedom. He is the winner of the Society of Americans Allen Nevins Prize and the Society of Civil War Historians and J. Bailey Prize and Anthony E. Kay Memorial Essay Award. His research on the wartime slave trade was also a finalist for the Southern Historical Association's C. Van Woodward Award. His writing has appeared in the Journal of the Civil War Era, the Journal of the Early Republic, and Slavery and Abolition. He has also published on Civil War monuments and written on disease in the domestic slave trade. Dr. Colby earned his BA in history from the University of Virginia and his master's and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to coming to the University of Mississippi, he was a postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor in the Center for American Studies at Christopher Newport University. And I'm sure he would be happy for me to mention that his talk tonight comes from his 2024 book of the same title, published by Oxford University Press. So, if you could bear with me, I'm going to stop my screen share. As always, we ask you to hold on to your questions till the end, and we will do our best to answer them all. All right, I should have stopped my screen share.
All right, I'm gonna, if I can find, I'm gonna pull up some slides and I'm going to share my slides. We're gonna hopefully do a relatively seamless handoff here. Hopefully. All right. Well, first of
Looks
all,
good.
good evening. It looks good. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking with you all tonight. I particularly like to thank Scott Rosenau for inviting me and Adam for doing all the hard work to make this event happen. And I'm looking forward to sharing a bit out of my book. As Adam said, it came out last year. An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Um, this is probably a risky place to talk about this, given what I'm sure people who are in the audience may know more about this even than I do. But I want to start with, like, as I said, an event that I think some of you may have known pretty well. In June 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia moved into Maryland and Pennsylvania, bound, though they did not know it yet, for Gettysburg. And as it did so, soldiers and civilians accompanying the army began to round up African American residents of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Black residents of communities like Chambersburg and Greencastle fled and hid. But those people whom the Confederates found in these areas, they captured, they bound together, and in a phrase that appears repeatedly in the letters and diaries describing this moment, they rounded them up like cattle. Among the victims of the Confederate raid into Pennsylvania were Jane Lyles and several of her children who lived and worked at Thaddeus Stevens's Caledonia furnace between Chambersburg and Gettysburg. In addition to destroying Stevens's furnace, Confederates captured the Lyleses and sent them south behind the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, the fact that this happened, as I said, I suspect is not a surprise to any of you. Most accounts of the Gettysburg campaign these days at least mention, and if not devoting relatively significant time to the fact that Confederates did capture hundreds, perhaps as many as 1,000 men, women, and children during their advance into Pennsylvania. But these people often depart the story in the wagons carrying them south. Well, what I want to talk about today is essentially what happened to them next. In some cases, individual white Southerners laid claim to Black Marylanders or Pennsylvanians, arguing that they were people whom they had once enslaved, and thus those individuals kidnapped from the other side of the Mason-Dixon line were actually fugitives from slavery who could be legally re-enslaved. In many instances, however, Confederates sent the individuals they captured to slave markets in the Confederacy, including and particularly the one in Richmond, Virginia. This building, which no longer exists, if you've ever driven through I-95 or driven on I-95 through Richmond, you cross right above where this building would have been. This is the auction rooms that belong to the slave trading firm of Dickinson Hill and Company in Richmond. Now, I don't know that Jane Lyles particularly ended up in this building, but she certainly ended up in the Richmond slave market, and there Confederates divided her and her children. They sold Jane to Savannah, and the children probably somewhere else in Virginia. Now, this isn't a one-off. This isn't a fluke. This is a regular part of something Confederate armies did, and indeed some of the soldiers who crossed into Pennsylvania planned explicitly to capture people and sell them. As one North Carolinian wrote, he, quote, expected to make purchases in that line, meaning enslaved people, for Southern exportation. This dovetailed with the larger Confederate project. As Allen Guelzo has argued in his book, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, and this is a quote, I'm quoting Guelzo here, to have left Pennsylvania's blacks in undisturbed freedom would have been tantamount to denying the validity of the whole Confederate enterprise. Selling people who, whether by birth or by flight, had become free, affirmed the Confederate commitment to enslavement. Now, thus far, again, I suspect that this story is at least somewhat familiar, and it has sort of its own logic. Capturing and selling people not only benefited individual Confederates, but affirmed the system for which they fought. But we're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle here. Simple opportunism and ideological motivations might explain why a Confederate would sell someone like Jane Lyles during the Civil War. But why would someone be looking to buy a woman like her during that conflict? This becomes even harder to explain given the immediate context of mid 1863. The Confederate economy was teetering. Inflation, particularly, was a huge problem. It had averaged 10% per month across the first 2.5 years of the Civil War, and it was beginning to accelerate into even higher levels that summer. Emancipation was now an avowed war aim of the United States. And while Confederates captured Lyles before the setback at Gettysburg, their sale surely took place after the battle, meaning that whoever purchased them would have been aware, at least somewhat aware. I realize that the reporting is fuzzy. I realize Confederates received Gettysburg particularly in different ways, but the person who purchased them surely would have been aware that Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania had been repulsed, and perhaps more importantly, that Vicksburg had fallen on the Mississippi River. And yet, someone, indeed multiple someones, did buy members of the Lyles family. This reality speaks to what I think is an often overlooked part of the Civil War. Um, One few historians have ever discussed. But as I read Civil War letters and diaries alongside newspaper articles, court records, military documents, narratives from people enslaved during the war, I realized that white Southerners carried on a massive commerce in humanity during the conflict, buying and selling thousands of people between Fort Sumter and Appomattox. What I'd like to do tonight is to discuss what this meant for the conflict, some of the reasons why, particularly, in spite of all the challenges facing them, Confederates did so, and what this meant for all the inhabitants of the wartime South. Now, before moving forward, I think it might be useful to briefly outline what we're talking about when we talk about the domestic slave trade. This is a map created for my book. In essence, what we're talking about is the purchase, the sale, and often forced movement of enslaved people within the United States, as opposed to the traffic that took place across the Atlantic Ocean as part of the larger Atlantic world slave trade. By the outbreak of the Civil War, the United States' internal slave trade was roughly a century old and a flourishing enterprise. In the preceding 4 decades, 5 decades, particularly after Congress banned Americans from participating in the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, domestic slave traders moved between 6 and 800,000 people from upper South cities like Richmond, Alexandria, um, Baltimore, Washington, depending on how we define Upper South, perhaps Louisville, St. Louis, even as far as Charleston, and sold those people in cities like Memphis, Natchez, and especially New Orleans. From these cities, individual slaveholders and slave traders then moved these hundreds of thousands of people to wherever the frontier of the cotton and sugar kingdoms happened to be at that given moment. The domestic slave trade was immensely important in the antebellum South, and the human property moved through it brought enormous wealth to anyone involved. This came not just through the cash crops that people grew in the Cotton Kingdom, but also through the value that the slave trade placed on each enslaved person. Because each person, any person enslaved in the South, could theoretically be sold, they always carried a price. And that price could be a price, that monetary value could be translated into credit, mortgages, even securities that then circulated through the wider worlds of American and Atlantic finance. This was really significant. By the time the Civil War began, enslaved people, the 4 million people enslaved in the United States, were worth an estimated $3 billion. In 1860 dollars, that made them the second most valuable form of property in the United States. They're worth more than all the money sunk into the railroads. They're worth more than anything Wall Street has produced. They're worth more than all the money held in all the nation's banks. The only thing worth more than people in 1860 is land. Um, and so, in short, as we want to think about it, the American slave market, and here we see one of its most infamous uh, sites, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans. The American slave market, as you can see from this picture, was big business. Now, despite the vigor of the antebellum slave trade, the Civil War would seem to be an unlikely time to be participating in the slave trade. The onset of the war had wrecked the cotton economy that had long underpinned the sale and purchase of enslaved people. As we said, inflation undercut people, not only created economic disruption, but in doing so, made it difficult to buy or sell anything, much less something as valuable as people. And the persistent flight of enslaved people, combined with expanding U.S. emancipation policies from the Confiscation Act to the Emancipation Proclamation and beyond, made Black freedom one of the United States' war aims, which imperiled not just the slave trade, but the institution of slavery writ large. And yet, as I dug into Civil War documents, as I dug into the record, as I listened to what people were saying during the war, Moment after moment emerged from the record where the slave market was clearly bound up with what was happening in the larger conflict. Uh, and what I found was that Confederates, particularly, used the slave trade to adapt to the many challenges the war placed upon them. They used thousands of transactions in enslaved people to shape their experiences of the war, whether to acquire laborers, to mobilize for the conflict, or to weather the challenges that it threw at them. Uh, others used it to offset the advance of emancipation or to invest in the slaveholding future they thought the war would bring. For enslaved people, meanwhile, the ongoing slave trade dramatically shaped the onset of freedom and the way that they experienced it, uh, drawing many into what I would call a retrograde movement of slave commerce, a movement away from the freedom that the war offered. And yet, even within this, the slave trade's effects were mixed. For the threat of sale inspired many people to pursue freedom, to make the risky decision to escape. Regardless of what choice they made, though, the effects of the slave trade on the lives of people enslaved in the United States reverberated long after the guns fell silent. Now, I want to say a bit about the overall trajectory of the slave trade during the Civil War. To the degree that people and historians have looked at this, to the degree that we've talked about this to this point, it's been generally assumed that the slave trade ended fairly quickly for many of the reasons that I discussed. And there is a measure of truth to this, but it depends entirely on when and where you look. As a general rule, it is fair, I think, to say that wherever United States forces held sway, the slave trade did diminish considerably. This happened for a very straightforward reason. Wherever you have United States soldiers or United States sailors in considerable numbers and for a persistent period of time, the combined weight of enslaved people's own efforts to pursue freedom and the ways in which soldiers and sailors abetted these efforts, however ambivalently they did this, uh, this undermined white Southerners' confidence in their ability to keep people as property, which generally made slaveholders in these regions, whether we're talking about Eastern Virginia, whether we're talking about Kentucky, whether we're talking about Southern Louisiana, this generally made slaveholders in these regions unwilling to speculate on the purchase and sale of enslaved people. Enslaved property was simply too risky an investment to sustain a market for it. There were, of course, exceptions, even in Union occupied territory, even within the United States itself. In the border states, for example, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky, slave transactions certainly continued. And in many ways, they had to continue given the ways in which slavery was bound up with things like the laws of inheritance. One Union general, though, estimated that enslavers had sold thousands of people between Missouri and Kentucky alone during the Civil War. Marylanders, meanwhile, kept tabs on Virginia's slave markets and opportunistically moved people across the Potomac River. Even in where Union Army had footholds within the Confederacy, Union soldiers sometimes abetted the slave trade rather than emancipation. Some Union regiments, for example, became notorious for kidnapping and selling people across the lines to Confederates. But as a general rule, it is fair to say that an unmistakable trend emerged during the Civil War. Where the United States held sway, slave markets dried up, which means that in roughly the first calendar year of the war, major slave markets, cities like Alexandria, Virginia, Norfolk, Memphis, New Orleans, and to some degree Natchez, all but disappeared, erasing some of what had been the nation's largest slave markets. But, and this is critical, this is a, so to say, this is an advertisement for a slave sale, I believe, in Kentucky. Um, but, and this map is from roughly the fall of, this is from the summer of 1862. Um, Much of the Confederacy remained outside of federal control for most of the war. We're talking about places like Virginia, south of Richmond, most of the Carolinas, most of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, as well as the Trans-Mississippi West. In these places, the domestic slave trade survived and in many cases thrived as slaveholders remade markets in man to fit their needs and speculated in the opportunities the war provided. Texas is a good example of this. The enslaved population of Texas boomed during the Civil War, thanks to the mass exodus of slaveholders from the Mississippi River Valley, Missouri, parts of Arkansas, things like that. When these people got to Texas, they often found it difficult to feed, supply, clothe, house the enslaved men and women they had brought with them, much less to employ them profitably. Local slaveholders thus took advantage of this situation and bought people at what they considered to be bargain prices. The same thing happens to a lesser degree in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, particularly as slaveholders from places like Northern Virginia or the Sea Islands fled into the interior, driving people to slave markets before them. A Confederate war clerk in Richmond, John B. Jones, reported in October 1862, for example, that virtually every train car arriving in the city was packed with African Americans sent there from places like the Peninsula or for Northern Virginia, many of whom were destined for Richmond slave markets. Again, it's not that hard necessarily, I think, to see why Confederates might want to sell enslaved people during the Civil War. The more perplexing question from our standpoint, I think, is why would anyone want to buy them? And while the specific reasons for which people did so were as varied as the personalities involved and the millions of individual circumstances the war created, I want to talk about three main motivations behind Confederates' continued willingness to acquire enslaved people during the war. I want to talk about how it helped them navigate wartime crises, fend off emancipation, and lay the economic foundation for their post war futures. The first, this adapting to needs created by the war stems in large part from Confederates' near total mobilization for war. Creates an enormous amount of need in the Confederacy, especially for labor, and particularly as Confederates sought to build a war account economy basically from scratch. Virtually all white men are fairly quickly in military service, and as a result, all this work falls on enslaved laborers. This is particularly apparent in the industrial firms that exploded during the Civil War. Places like, as you see here, Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works. Tredegar, and I'm using it as a stand-in for, you could use it as a stand-in for numerous firms. Tredegar had always used enslaved laborers, dating back as far as the 1840s, but where they'd used maybe 40 or 50 enslaved laborers at that point, by 1864, more than 700 African Americans labor at Tredegar. Um, Many of these people Tredegar hired, rented from enslavers, but particularly given the increasingly cutthroat competition for workers, particular laborers, Tredegar felt the need to buy outright to ensure that they had the people they needed and that they could fulfill the obligations, the demands the Confederate government made on them. So in October 1862, for example, they purchased a blacksmith named John. And to ensure that John was as productive as possible, they also bought his family. Uh, Again, they want to make sure maybe that John doesn't run away, that he's happy, that he has the incentives he needs to do the work they're going to require of him to make rail ties, armored plating, cannons, and so forth for the Confederacy. They're not the only ones doing this. In the Shenandoah Valley, Buffalo Forge bought two men, but not to work in the forge itself. Rather, they sent them off to work on fortifications near Richmond. The Confederate government had demanded a certain number of men from their county. Rather than send skilled workers, they bought two people, sent them to do the work on Confederate fortifications, and then when they returned, they sold them again. This industrial firms throughout the South, coal mines, railroads, iron foundries, all buy enslaved laborers during the war. And I'm arguing here that the upheaval of war and the needs that it placed on the Confederacy drove individual enslavers and corporations to the slave market to secure essential labor. Individual Confederates do this on a much smaller scale. For example, as the war ground on and as the infrastructure required to move food throughout the Confederacy deteriorated, some slaveholders chose to sell people whom they could no longer feed. Sometimes they did so, moreover, to raise the money needed to feed enslaved people they planned to retain. As one South Carolinian put it, because of this, her neighbors were, quote, selling Negroes all the time to furnish support for the rest. Another South Carolinian did the flip side. He purportedly purchased more than 100 enslaved people during the war. After acquiring them, he put them to work raising food that he could then sell in markets like Charleston and Savannah, these crowded cities desperately in need of provisions. In other cases, individuals bought or sold people to help them mobilize for the war. One of the examples that surprised me when I came across it first, but then started to show up all the time, was Confederate soldiers looking for substitutes, looking to get someone to take their place in the army. As Confederate money deteriorated, that was not a very appealing option for a would-be soldier. But what was appealing was the prospect of acquiring an enslaved person. As you can see in this receipt, the writing is a little hard to read, but in Rusk County, Texas, for example, Charles Scott took on another man's obligation to serve in the Confederate military in exchange for a 16-year-old girl named Charlotte. He was one of a group that another Texan complained would not even talk about money as compensation for service, but who instead demanded slaves. On sort of the flip side of this, I've seen rumors, though limited actual evidence, of Confederates buying enslaved people to meet the requirements of the so called 20 Negro Law, a provision in the Confederate draft legislation that allowed one man to remain out of service for every 20 enslaved people there were on a property. Women on the home front faced additional burdens and sometimes demanded help for their new duties, cries that often were answered through a trip to the slave market. As one Texan believed, buying a slave could, quote, keep my darling daughter out of the kitchen and, quote, enable her to the better to pursue with assiduity her studies and the accomplishment of her mind. In other cases, and like I said, this is a hugely varied process. In other cases, free people of color used the disrupted wartime slave market to acquire family members, securing them from the whims of the slave market. In short, the Civil War created wide ranging reasons and sometimes favorable conditions under which inhabitants of the Confederacy acquired enslaved people. Now, besides adapting to the crises of the war, Confederates used the slave trade to fend off the effects of emancipation. During the war, we know that hundreds of thousands of people fled to Union armies or otherwise seized their freedom. The best guess of how many people did this is probably 450 to 500,000, though that number could be as high as 800,000. I love this map. This is from a project they haven't had it up for a while. Run out of the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab. It's called Visualizing Emancipation. Each of the red dot represents what they call an emancipation event. And when the database is working, they've been repairing it for a while. You can click on it and get the details of this sort of event. What this map shows is that, yes, we're talking about a significant number of events, a significant number of people seizing their freedom. But if we take that 400, 500, 800,000 number, whatever it is, it means that a maximum, excuse me, of 20% of the people enslaved became free during the Civil War. It's probably more like 12 to 15%. And this number, as you can see from this map, is highly concentrated in specific regions: Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, the Sea Islands of South Carolina, the border states, the lower Mississippi River Valley. What this tells us is that Confederates still held much of their purported nation, and that gave slaveholders leverage over enslaved people, even in vulnerable areas. Slaveholders throughout the Confederacy used the threat of sale to restrain people who might otherwise have thought about trying to escape. The survival of the slave trade forces them to weigh the promise of freedom against the price of failing to achieve it. If you fail as an enslaved person, if you run and you fail to get away, if you're captured by a slave patrol, if you're captured by a local sheriff, if you're captured by the Confederate Army, you stand a really good chance of being returned to your place of enslavement and sold away from your loved ones, from friends, from family. You see this play out, for example, in the actions of Charles Pettigrew. Charles Pettigrew is one of the largest slaveholders in eastern North Carolina, a particularly vulnerable region. Not only did enslaved people run to refugee camps in North Carolina or to Union forces coming inland from the Outer Banks, but they also showed up frequently as far away as Fort Monroe, significant distance away. Um, Charles Pettigrew was afraid that the people he enslaved might be planning to run away, and so he concocted a plan to, as he put it, sell the ringleaders as a means of intimidating the others into remaining. I will say it's unclear whether he actually put this into action, but it certainly was his preferred answer to what he saw as a crisis on his property. And even if Pettigrew didn't actually do this, many other slaveholders did. Uh, when enslaved people ran away, they were in fact often captured and resold. In Virginia's King George County, Confederates found a man named Moses in the Potomac River trying to reach a Union gunboat. They captured him, and his owner soon sold him in Richmond. Confederates are particularly afraid, though, of people who have fled, who have reached Union lines, and have been, but they have nevertheless been recaptured. I'll give you another example, another one that comes from the Gettysburg campaign. In Charlottesville, Virginia, a man named Henry chose June 1863 as his opportunity to flee from the Woods family who held him in slavery. Um, he had really terrible luck. We know that he headed into the Shenandoah Valley and he made it a ways up the valley or down the valley, I suppose. Um, but this was just at the moment when the Army of Northern Virginia was moving through the valley, and so they cut across his planned escape route. We know that Henry was recaptured, and that upon returning to Charlottesville, he was sent immediately to Richmond for sale. We even have the reasons, as the family patriarch put it, the what he called the quote moral effect of bringing Henry back on quote the balance of my Negroes will be very pernicious. In Greencastle County, another Virginia county down on the North Carolina border, a woman named Kansas or Candace likewise escaped from the family that held her. She and her, amazingly, somehow her child, made it to a refugee camp on the North Carolina coast. But somehow, and we don't know exactly how, this is one of the things that kind of eluded me in my research process. How did Confederates know where people had gone, and how did they maneuver to recapture them out of Union lines? Regardless of how, we know that someone slipped into Union lines and recaptured Candace. And we also know that somehow in that process, her child perished. Candace was taken back to Greencastle County from freedom into slavery and sold to in Richmond for $4,500. It's a number that reflects the inflation pervading the Confederacy. And she was sold explicitly because the people who enslaved her feared that she would run again. As Candace's experience shows, as Jane Lyles's experience shows, even people who had removed themselves from enslavement were not safe. We've already talked about the Gettysburg campaign, but the same thing happens wherever Confederates venture into Union territory. When the Confederates took Harper's Ferry on the way to Antietam in 1862, we know they sent train cars of people to Richmond to be sold. Similarly, on raids into Richmond, or I'm sorry, raids into Maryland and Pennsylvania in 1864, into Kentucky in 1862, when Confederates depart, they take enslaved people with them. In the latter case, in Kentucky, 1862, I know that a professional slave trader followed Confederates out of Kentucky with enslaved people whom he planned to sell. Confederates also target specific enslaved people for sale, including members of the United States colored troops. Uh, for example, many people captured at the Crater end up being sold in Richmond slave markets. Uh, I would argue that in doing so, Confederates are using the experience of sale to reduce these people from a state of freedom into renewed bondage, and to pretty explicitly rebuke the advances that the United States colored troops represented in African Americans' pursuit of belonging in the United States. The slave trade thus provided Confederates with a means of fighting against emancipation and served as a threat to those who were considering running away, and a way to make example of those who tried and failed in order to deter those people considering running. Now, sometimes this backfires. If enslaved people expect to be sold, if they get wind that a sale is likely, that actually makes them more likely to run away. A good example is this man here, a man named William Andrew Jackson. William Andrew Jackson, if his story is to be believed, worked as the personal coachman of Jefferson Davis. He had been hired by Davis to drive him around in Richmond. Um, in April 1862, Jackson got wind that he was likely to be sold, probably because the man who enslaved him had died a few weeks earlier. He and his wife discussed what to do late into the night, but ultimately decided that the best course would be for him to run away. He fled Richmond and a week later turned up in Union lines in Fredericksburg. Similarly, a man named Jefferson Lovelace, who arrived in Union lines in Kentucky, when Union soldiers asked him what prompted him to flee, he just said selling South, that he believed he was likely to be sold. In short, slaveholders find the slave trade a useful weapon against the threat of emancipation, as a means of confronting enslaved people's mobility through the retrograde motion of the slave market. It's a weapon that serves them pretty well, but it's one that also, again, in this sort of push and pull, this complex moment of the Civil War, inspires many people to flee as well. Now, besides the needs that the war places on Confederates, besides the threat of emancipation, I want to suggest one more, a third and final reason that I want to argue Confederates bought and sold significant numbers of enslaved people during the Civil War. And this one is stunningly simple on its surface. That is to say, for most of the war, Confederates think they're going to win. This sounds obvious. It took me a really long time to wrap my head around this one. Probably an embarrassingly long time to wrap my head around it. The fact that they think they're going to win fuels slave trading in two main ways. One, because in the long term they think slavery is relatively safe, enslaved people become a tempting investment in times of economic stability. At a moment when all assets are relatively toxic, to use sort of the modern parlance, enslaved people look less bad than a lot of the other investment options available to Confederates. Adding to this, Confederates think that enslaved people will appreciate, will gain in value to a considerable degree, because after they win, enslaved people will live in, and it will be, and the institution of slavery will be protected in a nation dedicated to it. I want to talk about enslaved people as an investment first. Remember earlier I said that the Confederates experienced hyperinflation during the war, 10% per month for most of the conflict, accelerating in 63, 64, and 65 to finish near 7,000% total. That means that most Confederates very quickly have very little faith in Confederate money. Its value diminishes almost immediately. The second you receive it, it is worth less than when you got it. In response, Confederates seek out what we would call real assets, forms of property they think will hold their value. There's not enough gold or silver in the Confederacy to be a viable strategy, and the government spends most of it on foreign aid and weapons almost immediately. Some people prefer stocks and bonds, though these are also vulnerable to inflation and are also bets on Confederates' ultimate victory. Uh, as a result, for most people with the means to invest, the basic three options are the nodes of the cotton economy: land, cotton, and slaves. Many people choose land or cotton. Both have a lot of appeal, most notably that neither can run away. Um, but enslaved people appeal to many would-be investors. They're more portable than land or cotton. They're more fungible during the war because they can be moved. That is to say, they're relatively liquid in a way that land or cotton is not. Not least because they can be moved easily. But also, they have the advantage, enslaved people have the advantage of essentially being an asset, a form of property, the value of which had risen fairly consistently for fully 15 years prior to the Civil War. Uh, and that's in a time of economic turmoil, including a major depression in 1857. They're seen as a very safe investment. As a result, when faced with the diminishing value of Confederate money, many people turned to enslaved laborers. As one North Carolinian put it, it was better to buy enslaved people than, quote, to run the risk of keeping much paper money on hand. Even though skeptical of the Confederate money, of the Confederacy's prospects, uh, recommended buying enslaved people. The future governor of Mississippi, William Sharkey, in 1862 said, quote, bad property as Negroes may be, they are still better than the money. Real estate and Negroes, a South Carolinian concluded, should be held by all who are not compelled to sell, because when peace comes, they will have some value. Now, not everyone has the means to engage in this sort of forward planning, but enough people did to ensure that hyperinflation created a significant market for enslaved people in the wartime South. Now, this only really makes sense. This is only something people did enthusiastically when they were sure the Confederacy wasn't going to lose. The language of Confederates and the people that that some of them targeted for purchase very strongly suggest that these people that there was a large subset of people, the sort of people Jason Phillips has termed diehard rebels, who just did not believe they were going to lose. One Virginian's refrain that he was, quote, sure the Confederacy would succeed was repeated all over the Confederacy and was often backed by estimates of what enslaved people would bring when the war was over. At the outset of the Civil War, the average enslaved person went for somewhere between $800 and $1,200. Confederates fairly quickly are expecting that when the war ends, enslaved people will bring at sale $2,000, $3,000, even $4,000, multiple times their pre-war prices. As late as 1865, with Sherman advancing through his state, a South Carolinian argued that his family should buy enslaved people. If we don't succeed, he said, the money won't be worth anything. And if we do, slaves will be worth 1,000 times more than now. Now, that's exaggerating, obviously, but it reflects a widely held attitude. You can see this speculation at play when Confederates target particular types of people. Coming back to this idea of why would someone buy Jane Lyles or her children? Well, uh, many Confederates targeted enslaved women and children, particularly for purchase. This tells us a lot about what they think is going to happen in the future. Because relative to an enslaved man, an enslaved woman, and probably an enslaved, and certainly an enslaved child, are not going to produce, to put it bluntly, a return on investment during the war. Enslaved children, particularly, are a long term investment. Slaveholders hold them in the anticipation that for decades to come, they will benefit from the costs associated with feeding, clothing, and otherwise maintaining children who don't do a ton of work. Um, Something similar can be said for enslaved women, although obviously enslaved women labor to a degree that rivals enslaved men. A lot of the value attached to enslaved women came via the fact that because of the laws governing enslavement, slaveholders owned not just the woman, but any children that she might have. Um, so if you're banking on not just enslaved children, but the future children an enslaved woman might have in the years, decades following the war, it suggests that at least a large subset of white Southerners believed that slavery would be secure if and when the Confederacy prevailed. As one Virginian put it, if this war is ever ended fairly, women and children are the property to put money in. A Louisianian soldier tried to sell a woman during the war because believed she was infertile. She was unable to have children. And his goal was to buy, or rather, he did buy two women whom he hoped, and this is a direct quote, it would, in all probability, would increase before many years, a time frame that clearly extends beyond the war's horizon. So the slave market, I'm arguing here, allows the Confederates to invest as the war requires them to invest, but also to, in a sense, perform their faith in their overall project, demonstrating a clear commitment to establishing a nation based on slavery and reflecting a faith that slavery would be extended going forward into the future for years, probably for decades after the end of the conflict. Now, I want to say, even though they failed in this project, the human cost of the wartime slave trade redounded deep into the postbellum period. Um, this is an ad placed by a woman named Tula Butler. Tula Butler and her daughter had been sold during the war. Tula ultimately made her way to Alexandria. And after the war, she began looking for her daughter Hannah, who'd been sold during the war. After the Civil War, likewise, Jane Lyles wrote from Georgia to Thaddeus Stevens, seeking his help in finding the children from whom she'd been parted during the war, and his help in returning to Pennsylvania. I have no evidence that Tula Butler ever found her daughter Hannah. Likewise, while the Freedmen's Bureau was mobilizing to help Lyles return, she disappeared, and I have no further record of what happened to her or to her children. The Freedmen's Bureau went looking for her children in Virginia, and while they did not find them, they did find other children who'd been kidnapped from Pennsylvania and sold, and did reunite those children with their mother. The case of a black soldier named Richard Johnson is even more extreme. Richard Johnson had enlisted in 1863 in the 7th United States Colored Infantry, and he disappeared fighting before Richmond in 1864. For decades, his family assumed that he was dead. His mother even applied for a pension on his behalf, as arguing she was his dependent. For decades, the family assumes that he is dead, but in fact, he'd been captured. He'd been sold through Dickinson Hill and Company to Greensboro, North Carolina. Uh, After the war, he got married and he continued to sort of move south. He ultimately ends up in Louisiana, following work and other opportunities. The Johnson family only realizes Richard isn't dead when he applies for a pension in the early 1900s. Because his mother had claimed a pension on his behalf 4 years, or I'm sorry, 4 decades earlier, the government, this set off the radar of government fraud investigators, and they began to start to put the story together. Eventually, this brought Richard Johnson into contact with family members whom he hadn't seen in at least 40 years. Uh, so to the degree that this family reconnected after being sucked into the wartime slave trade, it took decades. And this is not an uncommon thing. So besides the psychological trauma that such losses obviously caused enslaved people, it's meant that they were entering freedom lacking the wholeness that they sought. For people enslaved in the United States, freedom was more than just liberation from bondage. It meant autonomy, yes, but it also meant opportunity. And I would argue above all else, it meant family. Enslaved people like the Lyles, like Tula Butler, like Richard Johnson embodied aspects of the freedom the war provided. But also, we should remember, not least because many of them were able to move around during the war, but we should also remember the other forms of movement that the war sparked, including that driven by the surviving domestic slave trade. Not least, we should recall the ways in which the domestic slave trade denied people core parts of freedom, a reality that shaped the war's legacy for decades thereafter. I appreciate you having me to speak tonight. I know we covered a lot of ground pretty quickly, so I would be thrilled. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Robert, for everything you presented tonight. Um, I'm hoping this fuels a lot of questions, a lot of thought out there. Um, you know, it's something that has been discussed a lot more, justifiably a lot more in the last few decades by Civil War historians. Just the fact that for so long historians avoided talking about slavery directly. Um, and of course, the lost cause myth, which systematically restricted conversations about slavery, or so many people that pretended it wasn't the essential thing to talk about. Or I think I'm looking up at his book right now. James McPherson, I think, said
Hmm.
that it's fine to say that there are other causes of the Civil War, but if you take away slavery, there is no Civil War. It doesn't
That's right.
happen.
That's right.
Um, and the fact that we tend to think about um yeah, maybe another way to say it is, a serious student of military history needs to understand that economics and military history are enmeshed. You can't consider one without the other. You can't think of both sides in a conflict as, they start at this point and they get to this point, and then nothing changes that
Hmm.
influences these factors. I mean, anybody who studies the Civil War, World War II, understands how much economics play a role in what happens. So not to mention the human element, which is the real element that's worth discussing here. So if anybody has questions, oh, we sure do. Okay. All right. Several questions here. This is great. Thank you for your participation tonight. Starting with Bill Landis, um, are there any proof of sales in the West, such as Texas or elsewhere, after April 1865?
Yeah, there are a handful, and they show up in part because the ones that I know about, at least, mostly show up in court cases over whether a sale that took place, for example, after emancipation had been sort of officially declared on Juneteenth in Texas, whether that contract was enforceable. But yes, there are absolutely a handful of sales in Texas, particularly. Those are the ones that I've come across. It wouldn't surprise me if a handful happened in other states as well. Uh, I don't have a great sense for why they took place, but they certainly did. Not significant numbers, I would say, but certainly a modest number took place after, even after Appomattox, even after Juneteenth. My guess, if you had to, if you asked for an educated guess, my guess would be people are sort of hoping that slavery will be replaced with some other sort of form of control of African Americans' labor, and they're kind of trying to position themselves in that regard. But I couldn't guarantee that.
An interesting question here from Scott Rosenau, Assistant Program Director.
Hmm.
Have you found instances of slaves being sold to the islands, to Caribbean islands, as more of the South was occupied and some of the markets dried up?
There are a handful of examples of that. The example that comes to my mind is Adam Rothman has a book called Beyond Freedom's Reach about an enslaved woman taken to Cuba from New Orleans during the war. And there's this eventually the State Department gets involved in returning her after the war. That's the best example I can think of, though I don't recall if she is explicitly sold to Cuba. What I would say is that there are persistent rumors that this is happening. Uh, those cut in a lot of different directions. Confederates, for example, regularly tell enslaved people that actually Union soldiers are going to be the ones who
Mhm.
will sell them to Cuba. This is a persistent rumor throughout the Civil War. You find enslaved people mentioning it from Virginia to Louisiana. I will say I have not found a lot of hard evidence that this took place. Um, but if you told me that it did, I would believe you.
Um, Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm probably going to get my years a little off on this, but um, a lot of Americans might not be familiar with the fact. I think slavery was only banned in Cuba in 1875. I might be off on that
It's
year.
after the Civil War. I want to say it might be 68. Um,
Okay,
but
okay,
but well, I can't remember. I also can't remember the exact year. But yes, in Cuba and
okay.
Brazil, slavery is not banned until well after the Civil War.
I think Brazil is 1885, which is
Yeah, it's
radically
late.
late.
It's in the
Yeah, it's very
1880s.
late. Yeah.
Hmm. I will
Um,
say I've never seen any evidence of people like the Confederados, for example, the people who flee to Brazil.
mm,
I've never seen any evidence of them taking enslaved people with them.
sure.
Um, if you told me a couple of people pulled it off, uh, I might believe you. I would. That's plausible. I just have never seen any evidence of it.
Right. Just a comment from Craig Johnson. Incredibly interesting presentation. As Adam said earlier, I knew almost nothing about this topic until tonight. So thank you. Thank you, Craig, for your comments.
Thank you.
All right. This is from William Monahan. When sale transactions took place between Confederates, what currency was used, or were they barters?
Mm. It's a range. It just sort of depends on who is engaging in the trade and kind of their evaluation of what's happening. So sometimes enslaved people are sold just straight for Confederate currency. Sometimes it's really about sometimes they're sold on credit, um, with the expectation of being paid later. Especially as the war goes on, especially as you get into 64 and 65, you definitely start to see enslaved people being bartered. for real estate. I've seen enslaved people being traded for like a lumber mill, enslaved people for building materials, and frankly, enslaved people for livestock. So yes, I would say that early in the war, there probably are there certainly is barter exchanges of enslaved people taking place. As the war goes
Mm,
on, as Confederate money becomes less and less reliable, you see people sort of foregoing its use altogether much more commonly. So yes, enslaved people are exchanged for all sorts of things, or Confederates exchange people for all sorts of things as the war goes on. To the question about Texas from earlier, if I recall correctly, one of those late transactions is an exchange of enslaved people for cattle, for instance. So
wow.
yes, as the economy deteriorates, unsurprisingly, barter becomes much more common.
Mm. Great. Just a comment and then a question. This is from Scott Mingus, who is no longer with us because I'm looking at the attendee list, but unfortunately he had to leave the session, but he just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Colby for a fascinating presentation.
I appreciate that.
Scott Scott Mingus is also assistant program leader with Scott
Mm-hmm.
Rosenau. I did not mention Kathy tonight, but Kathy Friel's still with us. She is a program director for the Civil War Roundtable, and without the three of them, we wouldn't obviously this wouldn't be possible. So we thank them for, and all three of them were able to participate tonight as attendees, which is great. Scott Mingus, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he's the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
author of, okay, all right, well,
Yeah. Oh
well
yeah.
over 40 books at this point. Uh,
The prolific
so
Scott Mingus.
prolific,
Yes.
yes. Usually he's not able to make these because he's out with his own books at different places, different venues. Thanks for your comments, Scott, wherever you are at this moment. And a final question, if there are any more questions, please type them away. This is from Jeff Stauffer. During the Battle of Gettysburg, a group of citizens from Greencastle, Pennsylvania, ambushed a column of enslaved people being moved southward and disarmed the guards, freeing the African Americans. Are there any other examples of this type of home guard citizens attack?
That's the only one that I'm familiar with. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, that's the only one that I'm explicitly familiar with. I'm trying to think if I recall anything from like the only other place I could really imagine seeing something like that would be like in Appalachia. Um, but that's the only one. That's the only one I can explicitly call to mind. The something close-ish to that, I would say is it's more through regular or semi-regular forces, but like in the Mississippi River Valley, you read reports of sort of massive numbers of enslaved people being captured and recaptured by Confederate raiders and Union forces and back and forth. But that's not citizens taking the initiative. That's
Right.
Confederate raiders, Confederate cavalry, and Union cavalry. You know, kind of working through the Union Treasury Department operated plantations all along the Mississippi River and tried to get enslaved people to work on them. They were incredibly vulnerable to attack, and so Confederates raided them all the time. And sometimes Union forces would raid back, and so you have people moving back and forth across the lines in that regard. But the Greencastle example is the only one I can think of where uh, citizens sort of stepped in and made that happen. There are also the only other thing, sorry, would be there are a number of uprisings in slave jails during the Civil War. The one that springs to mind, for example, is in Baltimore. The biggest slave jail in Baltimore, Marylanders use it to hold people who are either like part of litigation or who they're afraid are going to run away. And at very multiple times during the war, those people rise up as much against the conditions of their confinement, I think, as anything else. So that would be the other sort of close version you would see to that.
Well, that's those are amazing examples. I was not familiar with the story you just told about the Mississippi River Valley.
Oh yeah.
Has there been anything published on that? Oh, maybe you talk about it in your book.
Um, no, I sort of mentioned it in passing. I
Okay.
think uh the best thing I would say is Amy Merle Taylor's book, Embattled Freedom, talks about sort of the precarity. She traces some specific people's experiences in the Mississippi River Valley, but you get a pretty good sense for the vulnerability of these camps, the vulnerability of these outposts of United States colored troops. That's good. That's a good example. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I know Armstead Robinson talks about it a bit, but no one has focused super carefully on it. I think because it's pretty difficult to trace, what happens to specific people, and they're mostly one-off raids that don't necessarily produce a ton of documentation.
Okay. Well,
But yeah, but they happen all the time, right? If you,
yeah.
I was looking at newspaper reports just before we got on here, and I came across like two or three in just from like the summer of '63. So they happen all the time. Once you start looking for them, if you're looking through newspapers, if you're looking through the OR, you would find them all the time.
Okay. That actually leads me to an archivist kind of question. Would you be willing to talk just a little bit about your sources?
Sure, absolutely. Uh, I would say the sources were both sometimes hard to come across, but once I kind of started knowing where to look, I started to find the Civil War slave trade everywhere. So
Yeah.
I used a lot of obviously letters and diaries, mostly
Okay.
written by Confederates. I was really fortunate to write a lot of this book, or to get started on this book while I was doing my graduate work at UNC Chapel Hill, which has the Southern Historical Collection, one of the most massive
Okay.
collections of material from the American South. And so I really benefited from the ability to just walk over there and spend a couple hours a day, sort of pouring through letters and diaries. I read as many documents as I could find of sort of slave traders' surviving materials. There are collections of this. It's mostly their incoming correspondence, basically. This is scattered in libraries throughout the country. There's a pretty big collection at the Library of Congress, for example. I use military records. I use a lot of Freedmen's Bureau records. Those are digitally available now, and thanks to the Smithsonian is transcribing them, which means that every time I go and I run a search, because I just can't stop looking, I find more that I wish could have made it into the book. And I use the WPA narratives, interviews with formerly enslaved people. I tried to use those pretty judiciously, but I certainly use them. It was one of those things where once I started looking, I found references to the slave trade, not everywhere I looked, but pretty widely. It's not, and I think one of the reasons that no one has really written on this is it's very rarely the focus. It's very rarely the main thing that people talk about. But once you start looking for it, you start finding it almost everywhere.
Well, thank you for that. And I don't currently see any other. I don't see additional questions, so I think we're probably ready to wrap up. But we appreciate you speaking for us tonight about this. I encourage everybody out there to go out and get copies of your book for the full version. But we appreciate it, and I hope maybe we can have you back at some point in the future.
That would be wonderful. I'd be happy to.
Right.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real
Yeah.
pleasure.
Just a reminder for those who are here, a month from now, 4 weeks exactly, we'll be coming back in person to hear Dami Miller talk about talk about Catholic nuns who were the only trained nurses at the beginning of the Civil War. It should be a great topic for Women's History Month. So again, thank you, Robert. Thank you to Kathy and the Scotts, and we look forward to seeing everybody in person in 4 weeks. All right. Have a great night.